Representative Elmond.
Present.
Representative Angelos.
Here.
Representative Haroldson.
Here.
Representative Pendergraph.
Here.
Representative Sherwood.
Here.
Representative Smith.
Here.
Senator Driscoll.
Here.
Senator Garou.
Here.
Senator Larson.
Here.
Senator Smith.
Here.
Co-Chairman Bear.
Here.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Senator Smith, can I ask you to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? And Representative Pendergraph, could you give us a short blessing?
Lord, we do thank you for this opportunity to serve our fellow man. We ask that you would give us wisdom and grace in doing that. We thank you for the friendships that we enjoy here and for the camaraderie, and we ask that you would bless that as we move forward. Thank you, Lord, for being with us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So I think, as everyone knows, this is the first joint meeting of the JAC for this year. I welcome everybody. We have a lot of work to do. As the committee knows, we received extensive comments from the governor, other elected officials, agencies, and the courts requesting funds in December. We also received public testimony at that time. And obviously, our task now as a committee is to review and address those requests and make decisions on them. And I look forward to working with all of you and crafting a response to those requests. Co-Chairman Bear, would you like to offer any opening remarks?
Thank you, Co-Chair. I would. I am very excited to be here, very excited to do the work of the people. We have a very green behind the ears team here on the House side, so bear with us, but we'll work hard for the people of Wyoming. We have a lot of work to do, so I'll be brief and just say that we're grateful for the state of Wyoming to give us this opportunity to represent them. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So what we're doing today is adopting the rules, having a Craig report, dealing with some executive letters, and then conducting the agency callbacks. For purposes of how I will be running not only the JAC when the gavel's in my hand, but also when the Senate meets, I will have an order with regard to how we recognize entities at the witness table. First of all, I want the members to know that it will be my practice not to accept any amendments for any bills from the witness table. If you have an idea for an amendment to a bill that we are discussing, I would suggest you go through one of the members of the Joint Appropriations Committee, and then they will be able to offer that amendment and discuss it. But it will be my practice not to accept amendments from the witness table. I will also say that if you do have an idea for an amendment, that you give it to our staff ahead of time so that they are able to make copies and to let everyone else know that you have an idea. The order in which I will identify people for public comment will obviously be first elected officials, agencies of the state. Well, no, let me start over. Staff, then elected officials, agencies of the state, the public, and then those liaisons to that have interests with regard to the bill. So, with that said, we will start with. Let's see. We will start with the business. Let's start with the rules. Mr. Richards, can you go over the rules and just kind of give us an overview of what we're looking at?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I believe you received a copy of the 2023-24 permanent rules of the Joint Appropriations Committee. I can walk through those very briefly. That is one starting point. Of course, this committee needs to adopt its own rules, which could be these or something else. Rule number 1 is that the chairs shall alternate between days that the Joint Appropriations Committee meets. Rule number 2 is that at least 3 members of the Senate and 5 members of the House provide for a quorum, and that except the final vote on any budget bill, a majority of the quorum may conduct business. So a majority of those present can conduct business. I would also flip to rule number 14 because it's very closely related to rule number 2 and was, this indicates that the final vote taken on any bill, not just the budget bill, but let's say you had a substantive bill related to retirement system. Those bills also require a majority of the House, full membership of the House, and a majority of the full membership of the Senate, meaning 4 members on the House side and 3 members on the Senate side. Rule number 3 indicates that if you were to create a subcommittee, particularly during the interim is most likely, those subcommittees shall have at least 1 member from each party, and that the subcommittee must consist of at least 3 members. Rule number 4 relates to agency hearings, those hearings that you witnessed in December, for example. The chair allows committee members to ask questions, but statements are ruled out of order. That's pretty common practice with many other committees, and some members say, wouldn't you agree, or something like that, to modify their statement in the form of a question. Rule number 5 identifies that public hearings and agencies shall be allotted a specific amount of time for questions and presentations, and that public comment is allowed. The historic practice has been that the public comment is consolidated at the end of all agency presentations. It certainly does not have to be that way. You could take public comment after each agency, and the rule does not prescribe one alternative over the other. That is the co-chair's preference. Following the agency's presentation, in rule number 6, the committee members may ask a question, and the chairman can ensure that the questioning period does not extend beyond a set time. Rehearings or callbacks can be made by a majority vote of the committee or upon agreement of the co-chairs. And a great example of that is what I believe you'll be hearing today from the Department of Health. The co-chairs made an agreement to invite them to this meeting. Rule number 7 limits the number of times a member may speak on a single motion to 3 times. Rule number 8, 9, and 10 all relate to letters and presentations. Rule number 8 relates to executive branch letters, including all of the 5 statewide elected officials. And it is a great opportunity today. The State Treasurer's Office has a letter which will come before you. Rule number 9 provides for the same opportunity for the judicial branch. And then rule number 10 provides a similar opportunity for standing committees. But importantly, rule number 10 does carve out the ability of individual legislators to prevail upon the committee for a budget measure. Item number 11 provides that all motions of the governor or the governor's recommendations do not require a second, but all other motions related to the budget do. So if you wanted to amend the governor's recommendation, that would require a motion from one of the members of the committee under these rules, as well as a second. A second is not required for non-budget matters. So for example, if you were marking up a bill on the retirement system, just a substantive bill to go in the green books during the interim, these rules do not require an amendment to that bill requiring a second. All committee proceedings are governed by 28-1-113, and that is an outline of the expectations of the Joint Appropriations Committee and the introduction of the budget bill. Item number 13 gives an order of operations in terms of questions of the rules. These rules take precedent. Second, the joint rules of the Senate and the House. Third, the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures. And fourth, Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure. And finally, item number 14, I already addressed, but for completeness, I'll mention again, a affirmative vote requiring a majority of both the full House and the full Senate is required on any non-budget bill pursuant to Rule 14. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Any questions, Mr. Co-Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I move that we go ahead and adopt these rules as presented by Mr. Richards.
Is there a second?
I'd second.
Second. Any amendments? Okay, Mr. Richards, can you call the roll for that? I'm sorry. Yes, Senator Guru.
Thank you. Just a comment on what you brought up earlier about rules when you're have the gavel, just for a little color. We've gotten pretty loose around here the last couple of years when we're going through amendments, and folks bring amendments. Some of them are lobbyists, some of them are people that we work with every day, and it's just gotten kind of, like say, a little loose. And I think it's to the chairman's credit that he wants to try to tighten that up, because frankly, it does kind of create a perception out there that people that are lobbyists are coming to us just at the table with amendments, and we're just reading them in, when that actually isn't the case at all. We're usually talking and working with them, but the way we do it gives an appearance. And so asking our friends who are lobbying us, or individuals, or even other legislators who can bring stuff on their own, but still having them go through a member of the body, I think is a good idea. And like I say, from a perception point of view for our public, I think is a smart move. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. With that, Mr. Richards, why don't we go with the roll?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the motion is to adopt the 23-24 permanent rules for the 25-26 68th legislature. Representative Albalmand.
Aye.
Representative Angelos.
Aye.
Representative Harrelson.
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood.
Aye.
Representative Smith.
Aye.
Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Senator Guru.
Aye.
Senator Larson. Senator Smith. Co-Chairman Bear. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the rules have been adopted.
Great, thank you. The second item on today's agenda is the presentation of the January 2025 Craig Report. And I would suggest that in the interest of time, Mr. Richards and Director Hibbard, that perhaps if we could contain it to 30 minutes, that would be appreciated. But with that, who will go first?
Mr. Chairman, I'll lead off.
Proceed.
Good morning again, members of the committee. I do always make it a point that I'm actually changing hats. So 90% of the time I appear before you, I appear as LSO staff. This morning, I am also appearing for you as the co-chairman of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. For the newer members, this is a 9-member group comprised of 8 members of the executive branch and 1 member of the legislative branch. My co-chair, Kevin Hibbard, joins me today, and I would also emphasize that the term consensus is first and foremost among the operations of that group. For example, Mr. Hibbard served as the chairman of the January meeting, and he and the executive branch staff also took the first draft of your January revised report, and we appreciate that. This Craig Group was created in 1983 under a memorandum of understanding between Governor Ed Herschler and the Management Council of the legislature. The purpose at that time, and it has remained remarkably stable since then, is to remove considerable amount of debate on the floor regarding things like the price of oil. And Governor Herschler at the time observed that an inordinate amount of time was spent debating what the price of oil would be next year and the following years, and whether or not there would be sufficient funds for a budget amendment. And he recommended that a consensus group come and agree to a set amount of revenue, and that both the executive branch and the legislative branch do their best to adhere to that amount. Just from a personal observation, I think that process has served Wyoming quite well. Not all states have this. Many states follow the federal process, where there is an executive branch revenue estimate and a legislative branch revenue estimate, and they are often considerably different, and it creates additional opportunity for debate and considerations of that sort. I'll proceed into the revisions that were made. They are fairly limited. The Consensus Revenue Estimated Group modified 4 revenue provisions in the January update, but quite frankly, there were 3 non-revenue items. There were more accounting items that are actually more impactful to the fiscal profile than the changes to revenue. The first modification was a reduction in the forecast 2025 calendar year oil price from $70 a barrel to $65 a barrel. We have experienced roughly 4 months where the West Texas Intermediate price has been at 70 or below. December, for example, averaged $70.12 for the West Texas. Wyoming oil is sold at a discount to the Texas price, primarily due to transportation costs. So we often take $5 or $6 off of that WTI price to get a rough estimate of Wyoming's price. So you can see the last 4 months were in or closer to that $65 range. We also looked at investment houses, and they were also close to a $70 WTI, $65 Wyoming price. We looked at the futures at the time Craig met, and the futures suggested a Wyoming price of $62 to $63. Now, let me acknowledge the fact that yesterday, WTI was selling at $80 a barrel. So it looks a little bit different just 6-7 days after our Craig report has been issued. But let me remind the committee, our forecasts are not for tomorrow's price, not for next week's price, but the calendar year average. OPEC plus, meaning the OPEC nations plus, have the opportunity to increase their production and the potential of doing so. There are numerous geopolitical factors that have a direct impact on the price of oil. And so the group itself, I think, is comfortable with a reduction of $5 per barrel. Unfortunately, this has an impact to both severance taxes, federal mineral royalties, and ad valorem taxes. In total, the total impact is roughly $64 for a $5 change in oil. That's 64 million, reduction across all accounts. How that breaks out is about 26 million on the education side, K-12 school foundation program, about 26 million on the the general fund side, and then the balance actually is a reduction in the amount that would be deposited into permanent funds. So it has some impact. Our second change that Craig made is to increase our forecast calendar year 2026 oil production by 1 million barrels from 104 million barrels to 105 million barrels. If nothing else, this is a signaling of significant opportunity within Wyoming to expand its oil production. Over the past years, we've had exhibited strength in oil production. There is certainly enhanced opportunity to expand further. There are more rigs operating today than just 1 year ago. So that is just an indication. Certainly it softens the blow on the lowered price, and it gives an indication that Craig is looking for a bit more stability and higher production within Wyoming. Not unlike prices, we look at third-party estimates, including the federal government's Energy Information Administration. And quite frankly, they are even more optimistic than Craig is in terms of our oil production, at least in their range of potential outcomes. Our third change is really an accounting issue, and that is we modified the beginning fiscal year balance for the Common School Permanent Land Fund and the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. That's just really an accounting issue. We are unaware of some of the alternative investments when Craig met in October, so we wanted to get the actual market values correct when they came in November. It has no impact whatsoever on our yields. That is our forecast of interest, our forecast of dividends, and any expectation of capital gains. Rather, it changes the spending policy. What that means is it changes the location of where money is distributed, not the amount of money that is going to be generated. And because the spending policy is based on the prior 5-year ending market value, and we're changing that market value by a few $1 million in both cases, you will see the impacts of that revision, just a changing in the distribution of those funds, not a change in the total amount generated. For your benefit, I believe you all have a copy of the Craig report, and the distribution is summarized on page 5 in tables 4, 5, and 6 for the general fund, SIPA and LSRA, and the school foundation program. In particular, the general fund and SIPA increased, and the LSRA and school foundation program decreased. I would also note that we had some concerns about various general fund contributions from revenue. Specifically, we noted that our interest and dividends were lagging about $21 million. However, at the same time, we have already benefited from $105 million of realized capital gains. So those capital gains could be offset by future losses in the coming months, but it put Craig in a position where we're really not going to reduce our forecast for total investment when we're sitting on $105 million of realized gains. We do not forecast capital gains, but we certainly acknowledge them when they exist. Finally, our last and final change of Craig is a reduction of a total of...
Co-Chairman Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for a point of clarification, so what you're saying is that on the capital gains, it's only when these stocks and bonds are sold that you recognize them. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. And even then, we often don't include them in the forecast because in this case, for example, we have several months. That $105 million was, I believe, through October. So we have November through June of next year where that $105 million might grow. Certainly hope it does. And if so, it would be unanticipated revenue available during the interim when you're at home. Or you could also have a decline in the stock markets, or investment managers elect to sell some of their investments that are underwater, and we do have those. So I use the term we acknowledge them, but we do not forecast them. If I could continue
Please.
then, the final revision to the Craig adjustments in January was a reduction in state royalties. And candidly, I think we probably should have caught this in October, but we did not. And the coal and oil production on state lands is coming in significantly lower than we forecast in October. As a result, we have reduced the forecast by $21 million for fiscal year 2025 and fiscal year 2026. 2/3 of that amount, or $14 million per year, is deposited into the Common School Permanent Land Fund, or permanent savings. So that does not appear on the profile. 1/3 of it each year, which would be $7 million, 1/3 of 21 million, $7 million, does hit the profile, and it reduces the amount of funds available in the school foundation program. So what is going on here? The state royalties are notoriously difficult to predict because we have to get 3 things right. Number 1, the price of those commodities being sold, oil, gas, trona, coal, et cetera. The production volumes of those aforementioned minerals. And then third and foremost, which is the most difficult part of the state royalties, in my opinion, is the location of those activities. So if you have a large coal mine and it moves from a state section to a federal section or a private section, it can go from a very substantial amount of revenue being generated one year to little or no revenue being generated the next year, just based on the movement of the coal extraction from that mine. And finally, I would just caution, while we did not make any changes to other variables, some of them, for example, the realized capital gains, are a bright spot and provide us some protection against downside. There's also some revenue streams that are very important to the state of Wyoming and are struggling, I will say. And in particular, that is sales and use tax, for two reasons. Number one, the decline in sales and use tax from the utilities sector, and I think of wind development, is down notably year over year. And then the sales and use tax from mining is also down year over year, despite the increase in the number of rigs. We did not modify our sales and use tax. We are relatively close to the 3-year pace and 5-year pace, but I just would note that the weakness is evident in that sales and use tax. I mentioned at my onset that there were 3 non-revenue items that were also incorporated into the LSO fiscal profile, so I will touch on all 3 of those. The first of which is, and actually, if I might, if you have your goldenrod handy, I encourage you to turn to just the last page. The last page is provided to the legislature at the time of the Craig report in October and the January revision to that. I really like page 7. It only comes out twice a year because it identifies each of the activities that caused any changes to the revenue forecast. So there are 3 non-revenue items that are outside of Craig's purview. The first one on page 7 appears on line 24, and that is a general fund reversion of $9,145,505. That general fund reversion is unspent appropriations that were made by prior legislators. The activity, whether it is an operational activity or a capital construction project, has been completed, and the agency was able to return, meaning not spend their full appropriation, and that shows up as that $9 million. So that helps our bottom line. The second one is almost identical, and it appears on line 46. This is $1,572,000. This is reflective of reversions of school foundation program funds. And once again, it's the same issue, whether it be the Department of Education or a capital construction project. If those funds were, if the project was completed and funds were left over, those monies revert to the account from which they were appropriated, in this case, the school foundation program account. That's the second item unrelated to a Craig forecast. And then finally, if you will turn to line 45, you will see a substantial $65 million decline in forecast revenue. This applies because of the school finance model, the K-12 funding model. Those payments rely on a school district estimate of revenue, not a Craig estimate of revenue. In October, in our report, we noted to the legislator and all readers that there was a disconnect between what Craig forecast for revenues and what school districts were forecasting for revenues. That disconnect or difference was $43.8 million. I am pleased to report that that difference has been exhausted, and in fact, now school districts are a few $1 million more conservative than Craig. And that is the predominant reason. It's not the entirety of that 65 million. It's more, it's closer to 57 million or so of that 65, but it basically shows that the school districts are now very closely aligned in total. Any particular business manager might be higher or lower than Craig, and we respect that. You know, there are school business managers out there. We do a statewide forecast they're forecasting the property taxes in their very district. And in order to do that, they're forecasting natural gas production in Sublette County. And so we really appreciate the folks, and you'll see that Craig and the school district business managers are in line.
Co-Chairman Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Mr. Richards, when you have these schools correcting their prediction of what they're expecting on these property taxes, do you have to then make an adjustment in your long-term profile? Does this affect the long-term profile positively or negatively when they adjust this way?
Yes, Co-Chairman Bear. It does modify our long-term profile only for the first year. All of the out years, they do not forecast, so we defer to the Craig forecast for all subsequent years beyond the first year. And I would also, I do have a tremendous amount of respect for those business managers, so we are converging, and they have revised their forecast, but I would be hesitant to say that they've corrected it, because that implies that we were right and they were wrong. I'm not suggesting that. It's a joint effort. The last point of our presentation, I want to direct your attention to 2 additional lines, and it's also on page 7. We could walk through the details of the profile, but I think page 7 really distills all of the important information in this presentation. And it is on line 38 on page 7, you will see a decline of $11.55 million. Everything I've talked about today, all of the general operations, that's the oil production, the oil price, state royalties, investment spending policy, reversions, everything I've talked about today has a net impact on the general operating side of $11.55 million. Not tremendous for a revenue revision. On the school side, drop down to line 50, and you will see all of the changes in the Craig report from January had a negative adjustment of $96.1 million. Keep in mind, more than half of that was not a revenue revision, but was that accounting adjustment due to the school districts and becoming in alignment with the Craig forecast. However, that $100 million, I'm going to round, 96 million, that $100 million does have an appreciable impact to K-12's funding availability. It also illustrates that the demands on that account, whether it is the ECA, capital construction, tax relief, any of those activities all hit this account. They really don't hit the general fund account. So it still has a robust balance, but it is something to certainly take note of. With that, I turn it over to Director Hibbard or stand for questions for the committee.
Co-Chairman Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Richards, this last comment regarding this 96 million affecting the balance in the school foundation program, we have a backstop in LISRA. Are you anticipating this particular reduction leading to a use of that backstop in this next fiscal year or the current fiscal year?
Excellent question, Co-Chairman. No, we do not. And we do not anticipate use of that backstop. For the committee's edification, the state has only exercised that backstop once. It was just a few years ago. But if you want more confidence in my response, on page 4, line 51, even with all of the governor's recommendation, and that includes all of the capital construction, Campbell County High School, the ECA, all of the recommendations of the governor, there remains a forecast ending balance of $170 million. So that should be more than sufficient to avoid any use of the LSRA backstop.
Mr. Hibbert?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And as Don Richards said, this is the other hat that I wear for the state of Wyoming, and that is the co-chairman of the Craig. And I did host the Craig and chair that this year. And I do want to just, for brevity, thank Don for all his help and his staff, also all the Craig members and all the Craig member staff. All of them bring expertise to the table, and that's how we arrive at a consensus from all those sources of information. Thank you.
Yeah, let me echo that. Mr. Richards, you and your staff are just absolutely incredible. You're going to hear that a lot from me and others. So any questions from the committee that, from what you've heard on the Craig report? Anyone? Good. Well, next is receiving an executive letter from the State Treasurer's Office. What do we have? Welcome. If you can identify yourself for the public, and please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm Dawn Williams, Deputy State Treasurer. I'm joined here with our Chief Financial Officer, Katie Smith, and Bill Pilger, our General Counsel. We're here today to talk to you about a letter we submitted pursuant to legislative direction regarding the UW Capital Projects account. In 2023, through the capital construction bill, there was a $120 million appropriation made for the purposes of the Corbett Pool, West Stands, and student housing at the University of Wyoming. The university does draw requests from this $120 million appropriation and to the auditor, and the auditor is required through subsection B in this legislation to request reimbursement to that fund, the UW Capital Projects Account Fund, from us. And so then we are subsequently directed in subsection C to come to you and ask for an appropriation from LSRA to that account. And so, Mr. Chairman, that's what we're doing here today, is fulfilling the direction from the legislature.
Great. Any questions? Yes, Senator Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Williams, welcome to see you back in the appropriate room after a lot of years with me.
Thank you, Senator.
Is this the first draw on, you said it was a 120 million line. This is the first draw, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll, that's correct.
So we expect another 80 million coming somewhere down the line, probably.
Mr. Chairman, the language in the bill directs us that the maximum that we can request under this appropriation is 75 million, and it could only be 40 million a year. So, Mr. Chairman, Senator, we anticipate you'll see another request next year for $35 million.
Very good, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Appreciate
Chairman.
it.
Committee.
The next order of business is agency callbacks. I will let you know that the co-chairs invited both the Wyoming Department of Health and the Secretary of State back to the JAC based on some interest from committee members. The Secretary of State's office was unable to attend this morning, but I think the Department of Health may be here if they are. Great. Director, good to see you. You're right up to bat. So good to have you here this morning. For those of the public, maybe you can introduce yourself, and we will get into some of the questions that some of the committee members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Stephen Johansson, I'm the Director for the Wyoming Department of Health. Happy to be with you this morning and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Senator Larson, do you want to start with some questions that you may have for the director?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I went and visited with the director yesterday, and we were discussing some of the requests that he had made. Particularly, I had a question on, I need a little help here, I think. I think it was the 11,818,000. And I think the governor denied that, if I'm not correct.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Larson, yes, so a little bit of background on that request. This is for our early intervention and education program. what we refer to as the developmental preschools or the child development centers. These are services for children birth through age 5 who are identified with a developmental disability or a delay and receive preschool services through 2 different programs depending on their age in order to make them kindergarten ready and entering the K through 12 system with typically developing peers. About 14 regional providers across the state provide these developmental preschool services, and there's quite a bit of nuance, as we discussed yesterday, Senator Larson, with why we make this request, why this committee sees it a similar type of request every session. And that's because there's a couple of different things going on with the preschools. Number one, by statute, every child that is identified as eligible for these preschool services are counted every year based on the providers and communities conducting that identification work of who is in need, who qualifies for these services on a clinical level. And that's what we refer to as the child count. So that changes every year up and down, and based on the second element in statute, which is the per child amount that the department is directed to pay, we calculate the child amount every year by that per child dollar amount, and then provide what is this year's updated number of children, and thus the dollars that we would reimburse the child development centers for. The third element of statute that is longstanding, precedes me in the Department of Health, and that is an external cost adjustment. So very similar to the K through 12 education system, there's an ECA or external cost adjustment mechanism for the developmental preschools that's calculated every year, essentially passed down to the Department of Health from the education system on how that ECA should be calculated. And that's the third element that we bring to the committee, to the legislature every year. And as we discussed, Senator Larson, even further nuance there is that years and years ago, there was a legal interpretation of that direction to bring those 3 elements. But specific to the external cost adjustment, we have been directed by the legislature and by statute that every year we not only bring the current year's external cost adjustment, but all of the cumulative unfunded external cost adjustments from previous years. So we're compelled to bring that to you. In your budget book, in the supplemental, you'll find a lot of that information starting on page 46. We have a historic table that shows over the years what the legislature has and has not funded out of those external cost adjustments. So this year, the 11.2 million or so that you see in that request is all of those 3 elements combined: the updated child count multiplied by the updated per child amount that the legislature put into law, and the external cost adjustment that represents this year and previous years' cumulative external cost adjustments. The final thing I'll mention, Senator Larson, members of the committee, is further complicating our work and potentially the legislature's understanding of why this request is here is last year the legislature passed an Enrolled Act, a bill, I believe it was Enrolled Act 56, that changed quite a bit with the EIEP or developmental preschool system. 2 things in particular. One, you changed the date that the child count happens. That used to be December 1st. It is now May 1st. So it's a benefit because we actually had updated numbers for the child count preceding our budget submission and our budget hearing with this committee. The second thing that changed in that Enrolled Act from last year is the per child amount, the dollar amount in statute. The legislature raised that significantly. The third thing that changed was the way that the external cost adjustment for the preschools is calculated, more aligning with the K through 12 system. And so previously there was one inflation index that was used for that ECA. Now, similar to the K through 12 system, there's 3 inflationary indices that are used to calculate that ECA. So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Larson, members of the committee, forgive my lengthy description there. That really comprises those elements comprise the reason that request is in here. I'll conclude by saying that as you'll see on that table that I mentioned that shows the historic external cost adjustment the legislature has or has not funded over the years, you always retain as the legislature the option to change, modify, deny, elements or in full those external cost adjustment amounts. And so you'll see that on that table that in previous years, you'll see $0 in the ECA. In previous years, you'll see 1 million. 2 years ago, it was 4 million. Last year, both in terms of the child amount and the ECA, was the largest investment I have seen since I've been director here of about $12.2 million appropriation going into the developmental preschools. So, Mr. Chairman, hopefully that sets some groundwork and happy to answer any further questions on that request.
Thank you. Other questions? Anyone? Yes, Senator Driscoll.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Johansson, DCAs, and you probably told us and I wasn't paying good enough attention. Are we obligated under statute to pay those ECAs even though we haven't?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll, great question. The legislature is not obligated to fund those. We are obligated as a department to bring those external cost adjustment, those ECA requests. But again, as you see over the years in that table in our budget book, the legislature retains that option to take the full ECA request, the cumulative from previous years, and it's the will of the body of how much of that, if any, that you deem appropriate to finance.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, I was just unclear whether we were actually obligated or it's optional.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, Senator Driscoll, I think this is important. In this particular program, there is regulatory authority from the Federal Department of Education under what we call IDEA, and the Department of Education here. We interact with both systems quite a bit because these programs in the preschools are largely educational or special educational in their mission. Accordingly, with just like in K through 12 special education, we do have maintenance of effort requirements in the EIEP, the developmental preschool programs here. And to put it very crudely and maybe oversimplified, the federal government looks at our maintenance of effort on what we expend in programs like this to set a floor. So that when you increase spending, you're essentially locked into that level of spending through maintenance of effort. And there's a few provisions, but they're pretty strict on when a state can waive out of maintenance of effort. We've used that in the past when we had to implement budget reductions a couple of times during my time in the Department of Health, where the state saw, as the federal regulations would state, precipitous revenue declines. That's one element where you cannot violate MOE by reducing budget and expenditures in a program like this. The other elements are if the child enrollment goes down, and that does happen from time to time. We saw for a couple of years, several years ago, year after year, the child count did go down. And so we didn't have to maintain that level of spending from previous years where the child count was higher. So, Mr. Chairman, thought it would be relevant to mention this is one of those areas in interacting with the federal government where we do have maintenance of effort requirements and responsibilities. And it is, as your director of the Department of Health, it's frustrating. This is a relatively large line item in our budget, these developmental preschools for birth to age 5. To give you a sense of the distribution here, this is about a $72 million biennial program, of which the state general fund finances roughly $68 million of that. So don't mean to be cheeky, and we work very well with the federal government and the Department of Education, but when those times come where we have to make tough decisions on reductions and looking at maintenance of effort, when the state is forking over 90+% of the program expenditures, it does feel sometimes like the tail wags the dog. But we work through those things and try to make it realize the best position and the best general fund position for the state.
Co-Chairman Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. This question, you may be able to answer this for us, Director Johansson, or Mr. Hibbard or Mr. Richards, if you could just weigh in, because we have a very new committee here, but the governor denied this based on Senate File 19 from last year. And I'd just like to know how that interacts with this. We have it looks like a cap of $12,290,000 for this appropriation from that Senate file. If you could just give us a brief primer as to how that intersects with this request.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Bear, another great question that I neglected to mention. So in that legislation from last year that I was summarizing, there were two things going on. One, the bill did pass, the Enrolled Act passed. So did the budget bill that this committee and the legislature passed as well. In the budget bill, there was a footnote that stated it's the intent of the legislature, and I'll paraphrase, not to appropriate more in this program or in this request more than $12.2 million. So we had a little bit of a quandary in the executive branch when everything was being set into budget last year following the session. What is appropriated? Is it from the Enrolled Act, which was about 16 million and change? Or was it the budget bill with the footnote that sort of had a $12.2 million cap? So there was a difference of about 4 million. In working with the staff here, the State Auditor's Office and the Attorney General's Office, it was determined we go with the $12.2 million amount. And so the governor's denial and the discussion you see in the budget is really related to that. Here we are in the supplemental. There is operative law in the budget bill governing the current biennium that, unless changed, in light of this request or this committee's action or the legislature's action, would essentially cap that appropriation at 12.2 million. So if this request in our supplemental budget, if it were the will of this committee or the legislature to fund some or all of that, I think it would be necessary to adjust that footnote in the current 25-26 budget.
Yes, Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was looking back over the history. 23-24, governor recommends 1.9 million. The legislature was generous. In comparison, gave you about twice that. You got the maximum amount, 24-25. I guess my question comes down to, in this supplemental budget, how is this unforeseen? How is this an emergency?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Pendergraft, a good question. This is not something that I would categorize in our budget in the supplemental as unforeseen or an emergency request, but something that statute that the legislature compels us to bring every year by law. And so that, you're right, you go through that table. Last year, the external cost adjustment requested was just a little over 16 million. The legislature approved 12.2 million, but in prior years, as you see on that table, it fluctuates with what the intent of this committee and the legislature was.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Stefan. So let me make sure I got it straight that the number that was asked that the governor denied, that's the kind of the rolling number that is the add up of how far behind we are with what is indicated there. So what we've done the past couple of years is tried to catch up from years that we were way behind and try to get it a little closer. Is that a characterization of it, and as far as where that number means?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, yes, I think you can look at it that way, especially in prior years. Forgive me for maybe irritating you with my response, but there's so many factors going on with what changed last year that I just think it's important to know this is multiple factors within this request, including the ECA and the cumulative unfunded ECAs, as well as the updated child amount, per child amount that you all put into statute through the Enrolled Act last year, and the updated child count date of May 1st.
Thank you. If I can follow up.
Yes, go ahead.
Glad you brought up the child count. So that too has been, with COVID, with some of the things that happened, we lost a lot of children out of those counts because they just weren't coming to the centers to be, they were staying at home. And so that too's kind of thrown us off just a little bit, and I think had something to do with that change to the May timeframe from before. Is that not true?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, yes, that's fair. And it is worth mentioning that there was 1 year, a year-to-year cycle during the pandemic where because of that difficulty in child count and child identification, we did allow the previous year's child count to calculate the child development center's per child amount and allocation during that year. But it's also worth mentioning that fluctuates every year. We have years where the statewide child count happens and it's lower than previous years, and sometimes that year is higher than the previous year. It really just depends. But the formula, the math is actually pretty simple. We take the per child amount that's in statute, the number of children that are identified. Generally, we would do just kind of straight math there, but it always depends. It's subject to what the legislature appropriates. So based on those amounts, based on ECAs, whether funded or not, or funded partially, we do have the flexibility to say this is what we were appropriated, and we adjust those per child amounts accordingly.
One last,
Go ahead.
thanks. Talking to the folks that run these centers, all of which in one level or another also augment what they get in these, from these appropriations with fundraising on their own to make up gaps in funding and all the different ways that we do it. But they also tell me that for every dollar we spend on this in these early years, we save a substantial amount of money on the back end when they go into the K through 12 system and beyond. The numbers that I've seen from them and from their studies indicate that that's a number that's pretty close, if not even a little better, than what we're spending on the program itself. Is that more or less anecdotally true?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, forgive me, I would point you to those studies that the centers might direct you to. It's a difficult question. We've studied in conjunction with the legislature quite a bit, do these investments improve K through 12 outcomes? And we can provide some of that information on what we see in transitions. Essentially, kids who go through these programs, there's a certain percentage that don't have what we call individualized education plans or special education services once they get through to K through 12. But there's a percentage that still require and need special education services once they enter K through 12. I think generally speaking, nationally and the studies that we certainly look at, rely on, et cetera, do show that, early childhood education and especially, reading preparation, social preparation by the third grade level does correlate to some improved education performance as well as social outcomes. So I think there's certainly credence to those arguments.
I just want to make sure I'm clear, if it's all right, one last one, Mr. So by catching some of these issues early, that too factors into how that can save money down the road as far as what the school districts are already mandated to provide, that if we catch them early and can correct them like a speech problem or something like that, by correcting that there, then it saves something that would be happening all the way through if we didn't catch it or it got worse.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, I think that's totally fair and something that is really the baseline intent of a program like this. You'll pardon me because we're talking largely about fiscal issues, regulatory issues here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, having over the years visited a lot of our child development centers, spoken with their directors. These are providers, these are special education and treatment providers that they do very good work, and their sole mission is to try to help families out who are often in very, very difficult circumstances, not at their best moments. So I hope that's clear. We govern and finance and regulate a lot of provider groups around the state, this being one of them. And certainly believe that the Department of Health and all of our provider groups, their associations, et cetera, work very collaboratively and well together.
Representative Sherwood, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the informative conversation today. I'm wondering, so on page 46 of the budget narrative, it talks about the point in time, May 1st, 2024. So fast forward here to January. Do we have updated numbers on the child count and then what that would do for the per child estimated amount? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Sherwood, in the general answer to your question is yes, but I do want to caveat that legally speaking, and for the purposes of appropriation, May 1st is the child count date. So that's what would inform all of our calculations in a budget request like this. However, can certainly work with my staff. I believe that with the centers, we can pull data of how many children they are serving now, because identification and enrollment in services, doesn't only happen on May 1st. It really is kind of a capturing at a point in time who are on your rolls right now. So we can look at preparing that information for you to get a sense of how it fluctuates month to month during the year, but that's intended really to capture, and the change you all made in the legislature through that Enrolled Act last year was really intended to capture, children that enroll throughout the school year, as opposed to, capturing the summer months and the fall months prior to December 1st, which was the previous date. Now it's in May. So presumably, with the centers that are serving those children, you capture a more accurate picture.
Great. Any other questions? None? Yes, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Johansson, thanks for joining us again today and coming back. Thank you for the clarification, because I'll be honest with you, whenever I was listening in January or December in the back, and I'm like, he's presenting all of these requests that have been denied by the governor. Why is he presenting them? And thank you for that clarification. This is statutory, where you're like, hey, these are things that we've been told to come back and give direction on or give input on. So even though it was maybe a denial by the governor, you guys are doing that. So as I've looked through here, there were quite a few of those that were denials. How many of these are in that category? Are all these in that category, or could you just clarify on that for me?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harrelson, good question, and a little bit of process discussion to answer that question. So when the agency submits its budget to the governor for his consideration, that is at the end of August. The governor works with his staff, considers all agencies' budget requests, and then with those requests, makes his recommendations up, down, modified, yes, no, and those get submitted. So you will, even outside of our statutorily required requests like this one, you will see requests that we make. The governor recommends denial, but we still have those in the budget book for this committee to consider. So we did provide a document, which we're happy to redistribute if you don't have it, for our December hearing, essentially a budget roadmap where in all of our requests, we categorized them into essentially 4 categories. And those were Medicaid reimbursement rate increases. There's 3 of those that I, as director, felt it was important, relevant, and necessary. Unexpected emergency level requests to modestly increase some Medicaid rates in behavioral health, in home health for very high needs children, and in, bear with me, and in OB, obstetrics, labor and delivery, maternity care services for hospitals and physicians. The reasons for those, there's a couple of reasons for those. One, I think everyone here is familiar with the challenge we have in Wyoming with the service provision on OB. Well, we've had several hospitals in recent years turn those services off, and we are not the full market in Medicaid. There's a lot of private insurance, other insurances that are part of that, but about 25 to 30% of all births in Wyoming are on Wyoming Medicaid. So we're certainly a participant in that market, and we believe adjusting those rates up could help stave off additional closures. In behavioral health, we did a rate study in 2024 where we were really looking at where are our Medicaid behavioral health rates in relation to our best estimated cost that it costs the provider. And there's certain rates where we were significantly low, and you'll see that reflected in that request. And finally, we have some home health providers that approach the department and my Medicaid staff, and really for high needs children that need skilled nursing services in their home, equipment, et cetera, who were telling us we don't think we can do this anymore at the rates that Medicaid's paying. We studied that and found that in many of these services, we were paying roughly 50 to 55% of cost. This request would take us up to around 70% of estimated cost. That's the first category that you'll see in our supplemental budget request on 3 Medicaid rate increases that I believe are at the very least necessary for this body to discuss and debate. Secondly, to your question, are our required requests. This is the biggest one. So out of the approximate $14 million that I've requested in the supplemental, 11.2 million of that is in this developmental preschool category, which is statutorily compelled for us to bring to you every year. In addition, there's a very small request for county public health nursing salaries because of a change that happened at the state level and because of a law that you all passed that requires us to bring any difference of what state public health nurses are paid. If that changes, we have to bring that request to the legislature for county public health nurses. So that's in the required request. Third, we have some administrative requests that you'll see, relatively small, some of which save general fund in converting some positions, for example, from part-time to full-time, leveraging some federal funds, converting what we call AWAC or contract positions in our Medicaid technology space to full-time positions, but leveraging a lot of federal match there and reducing general fund obligations there. So those are essentially the three categories or so that I think justified me bringing the request to the governor and to this body. But throughout that, you will see in his analysis and recommendations, some of those are recommended yes to the legislature, some are recommended no.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director, for that excellent explanation. I appreciate that. An ask that I would give you, though, is this. So being very much a green behind the ears sitting back there listening, yours was the only real department that presented denials. And that's okay, but I think there has to be a clarification of that. Hey, these are ones statutorily I have to give. I'm giving this recommendation statutorily. Hey, this was a governor's denial, but I'm giving it anyways because these are the reasonings. And I think that for the public that aren't looking at this, and even maybe for all of us, that's a good clarification. And I would ask in the future that would be kind of the nature of how you present, because I think it's going to give us a better clarity. I have no problem with you presenting a denied request, but it's really good to know this is statutorily, I have to bring it, even though it was denied, I need to bring this. These are something, even though it was denied, I think it'd be really good because of just even what you just gave me. Great I love what you were just saying. Hey, we're trying to just get these nurses up to the same speed, or we've got providers that may not be able to continue to do this and we don't do a change. Great request. If you wouldn't mind in the future to just make sure there's a really good clarifier around that, just for those watching, as well as those in the room. I'd appreciate that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haraldson, your point's well taken. I appreciate that. And, we try as best we can to, elucidate that in all of our budget narratives. But to your point, very sensitive to this. The public, even some of our provider community, they're not reading lengthy budget documents, and that's fair. We have those discussions here with this committee. We try to provide distilled materials that are easy to reference to the committee. But as I've discussed with many of you over the past several weeks since our budget hearing, knowing that there's new members, there's different perspectives, there's different things that are helpful to you. Me and my staff we are absolutely want to make sure that we're preparing information that's helpful when you're making these decisions. So to the extent that changes or different layouts or formats for our documents that go with our budget book, please feel free to communicate with us, and we'll prepare what's best for the committee to help you make those decisions.
Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm still trying to wrap my head because I don't have the federal statute here. But I believe that you said you're required to ask every year, even though we're on a biennial budget. And I guess that's part of my question is, even though this is a supplemental to a budget that's already been settled, that's the requirement there. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Pendergraft, yes, one clarification. This is not a federal requirement that we bring the request every year. This is a state legislature requirement. And to be clear, not for our entire budget, for this specific program, Unit 2510, early intervention education, what we call the developmental preschool services. That is a state law, an interpretation of state law that requires us, when there is an external cost adjustment, And those external cost adjustments in K through 12 and in this system happen every year. When there is an external cost adjustment, we are compelled to bring that to this committee. You are not compelled to finance it, but we are compelled to bring it for your consideration.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just begging a little indulgence. So that's the Wyoming statute 212706.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Pendergraft, it would be found in Title 21. I'd have to get you the specific reference. But I will mention, I believe this was in the 2014, 2015 timeframe. There was an audit and a study conducted by the legislature around the preschools. A variety of factors were studied, products produced, et cetera. If memory serves, out of that study was the legal interpretation that I'm referring to of previous to that, your Department of Health, we were bringing only the current year's external cost adjustment for consideration, and we were told we need to bring any cumulative unfunded external cost adjustments.
Representative Angelos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, can you tell me what the status of the home community-based service funding is?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Angelos, yes, in general, over the past several years, there were several rate rebasings. By way of background, I will mention that in that system, this is a Medicaid optional service, what we call home and community-based services. And in this case, it's the comprehensive and support waivers for folks with developmental and intellectual disabilities. We do rebasing studies with an external committee of legislators, providers, executive branch staff every year. That results in a report that has recommendations to the legislature on whether to or how much to rebase those services. We can get you a breakdown of, and I'm sure LSO would have it too, of all of the rate increases that the legislature has improved over the years. And that's kind of the baseline funding. Those are matched generally 50% by the federal government, so it's essentially a 50-50 cost share with the state general fund and the federal funds. In addition, as is the case in many program areas across the state, during the public health emergency at the federal level, there were additional dollars allocated through the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, package that Congress passed. And in this area, there were temporary funds that were allocated, that we allocated and discussed with this committee 2.5 years ago, that are set to expire in March. Memory serves, it's about $3.5 million that's in that system. Because it was not unexpected, and because we worked with the Appropriations Committee and made it very clear to the providers those were one-time funds, you do not see those funds in my supplemental budget request. But Representative Angelo is happy to elaborate on any specific elements of that funding. It is a large, as you see in our materials, a large line item for those services. And those range from larger providers, what we typically call agency providers, to very small, to put it simply, mom and pop shops, not a business organization or a provider organization, so to speak. But those providers are typically what we would put on our supports waiver, whereas the comprehensive waiver are generally higher acute, more complex cases, and generally bigger service providers. But Representative, happy to elaborate if I didn't answer your question.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, Director Johansson, thank you so much for coming in, appreciate it. Members of the JAC, I think that concludes the schedule today. I do want to just briefly say that for the public's benefit, that the House Appropriations Committee will be preparing a state capital construction bill and a separate K-12 school capital construction bill in the coming days independently. So I wanted to bring that out. Mr. Richards, can you, the next meeting of the Joint Appropriations Committee meeting, what, is that tentative? What?
Mr. Chairman, it really based upon the two of you as co-chairs, I get the impression, feel free to correct me, that the House Appropriations Committee is going to be quite busy over the next 2 days, Thursday and Friday. So my sense is that the next Joint Appropriations Committee might be Monday, either 8 a.m. or noon, certainly your discretion. That's the sense I'm getting.
Yeah, and I think you're correct, and I think that we'll have a discussion and we'll probably be looking at sometime next week, so.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Grew.
just a quick question that I've heard this at the top, but I want to make sure I had. The Secretary of State couldn't make it today, or was that kind of a blanket, I can't make it?
No, he
No,
had.
he wanted to schedule
No,
it,
he had a
so-
conflict. I'm sure he would have come. but
So
he-
we're going to we're going to try to keep schedule? No, we're not?
Okay,
Okay.
yeah,
All
so.
right, thank you.
Okay, with that, thank you all, and I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks.